Welcome everybody to another episode of vBrownBag. I'm super excited today. I have Britton Johnson and Aaron Bolthouse, and we're going to talk about preparing to deploy NSX, which is one of my favorite topics. Some things to get out of the way. Quick notes: if you want to get in on the conversation, we have all these Twitter handles, but I will be looking at the Twitter hashtag vBrownBag, and we have all these channels for people around the world to attend. APAC, Brazil, EMEA, Latin, US. Choose or attend several if you can. You will see me in the Latin channel, Valdezir is in the Brazil channel. We have Greg Robertson. We have people all over the world, so it's always cool to do this. This is an episode celebrating Wisconsin, I think. I even left the picture for my good old friend Captain Hook over here. But these two guys, I met them last week. They're phenomenal guys, so I'm really proud to be hosting them. I will switch presenter over now to Britton, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
Sounds good. All right, do you have my screen?
Yes, I do.
Yep. All right, good. So let me back up here. So here's my 2-button bullet point agenda slide. We will identify the components to stand up NSX. We will answer some questions. That is all. I am Britton Johnson. I am the owner and consultant of my own company, Gigabrit LLC, in the Madison, Wisconsin area. I'm a 2-time vExpert. Aaron outranks me, but that's okay. I have a bunch of letters after my name. I have a blog, sort of, and a podcast I do with a friend of mine, Tony Reeves. And we just had a really awesome episode with Mr. Jason McCarty on some vSAN stuff. So if you want to learn about vSAN, go listen to the podcast. You can follow me on Twitters at VCIXNV. And Aaron, I will let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Britton. My name is Aaron Bolthouse. I'm the manager of IT infrastructure for Hatco Corporation, a mid-level manufacturer out of Wisconsin. I'm also a Wisconsin VMUG co-leader. And as Britton said, a 4-time vExpert. I have a also somewhat blog at vramblings.com, and you can find me on Twitter at vhouse563.
All right, cool. So, full disclosure, I helped Aaron's company Hatco deploy NSX in their environment, and as we were running through that, we had to do all this stuff on the front end to talk about standing up NSX and before we ever got to the point of deploying the first appliance in the stack, we had like 3 or 4 meetings to just talk about what needed to do to get there. And as we kind of got through this, I'm just like, I've not seen a lot of information out there for this, and so let's do maybe we can do a vBrownBag on this and talk about what it takes to get there, because it's just not super simple. So why prepped for a software product? And as I was running through this quote from the awesome movie Mystery Men popped into my head, because NSX is a paradigm shifting product. You can try to deploy it without preparing. You'll have maybe some success, but before you can properly run NSX in production, you're going to have to teach your old network a few new tricks. And there's a lot of moving parts to it, and to get this install going, and really none of these things are really optional. So that's where we're going. And then, like I said, I haven't seen anybody really do a whole lot of information about how to get this stuff done beforehand. So the short answer of, sorry.
I was going to say, we sure figured out that it's quite a long list.
Yes, it's a huge list, and so this is just the quick drive-by animation slide of everything that we have to do in order to get NSX rolling. So it's by no means a just click and get it done task. So step number 1, network discovery. This is something that most companies probably should do annually if you're not already anyways. A good network discovery does some really key things to point out, security holes in your environment, and a lot of times you just don't know what's in your network until you actually look for it. And as sysadmins, especially in smaller environments, you're putting out fires all the time. You don't have maybe you don't have tools that are constantly watching your network for you. So it's a good practice to get into of just roll around and look and see what's plugged in. I like to say, don't actually rely on software tools to tell you what's there. Do some looking, make sure you don't have old legacy stuff plugged in from 3 upgrades ago. I've seen that in a lot of places where you'll do a Wi-Fi access upgrade and there'll be still an access point plugged in some closet somewhere that somebody forgot about that doesn't have a password on the Wi-Fi. And you'll come across some weird stuff. So Aaron, did we find anything interesting when we went through your discovery?
So not from like a perspective like that, where you were talking about having like surprise equipment in the network, but we did discover some interesting things about some edge switches that may not have been upgraded as often as they needed to. A core switch that had a DHCP server on it that we didn't really realize was serving that. So we did find some surprises that we just are things that got built up over time that didn't get documented. So you go back and you're like, oh yeah, we did that 3 years ago. I totally forgot we did that.
Yeah, and I think that's par for the course whenever you're doing this kind of a deployment is, you especially, if you're the guy who does everything, if you're wearing all the hats, it's easy to forget about this stuff because, yeah, you did it a couple of years ago, or, even if you haven't been in the company very long, maybe 3 admins before you put something in never told anybody about it. So
right, and at Hatco, we certainly wear all the hats, so that's.
So it's not just a clever name.
Take that for what you want.
So step number 2, rolling through this here, and is enable jumbo frames. And this is a biggie. So jumbo frames is needed to be enabled on all server access switches, or if you're fancy enough to be running a spine and leaf network, leaf switches and your core switches or your spine switches. Basically anything that a VMware host needs to plug into to talk to another VMware host has to have jumbo frames on it in order for NSX to work. VXLAN is a network packet overlay technology, so it adds bits to each Ethernet TCP frame. And if jumbo frames isn't enabled, VXLAN frames won't be read by the network, and you won't be able to talk between stuff. So it's pretty. This is probably like your minimum requirement, especially if you're going to be using VXLAN. I should note, and we'll cover this a little bit later too, but not all NSX versions come with VXLAN as a licensed add-on. I think it's advanced and higher. The standard NSX deployment for NSX standard does not include it. So, if you're doing it on the lowest level, you don't have to worry about it. But I think if you're going to do NSX, you may as well turn this on in your network if it's not already on anyways, just because, if at some point you want to turn it on, that way it's done. You don't, in a lot of switches, you have to actually go through a reboot process in order to fully enable it. And so it's a maintenance window operation typically when you do this. We did not have to do that in your environment in Hatco, if I recall correctly, Aaron.
Correct. The vendor that we use can do it on a by-port basis, and it's just a configuration push, no downtime. And one thing I wanted to say about jumbo frames too is it can sound scary, like it can sound like a big deal to do, but if you think about it as in just a capacity standpoint, you can still put small frames through jumbo frames. You can't put jumbo frames through small frames. So turning this up in your existing environment really doesn't have a negative impact other than if your switch requires you to perform an outage. So if you're even thinking about NSX, or any other technology that might add more than your normal 1500 MTU frame size, then you should be looking at turning on jumbo frames anyway.
Yeah,
So,
it's definitely not a
we have a
bad thing.
question.
Yes, there we go.
The vBrownBag attendees are very frank, so they're like, okay, guy, give us the switch vendor name. Now, if you don't want to, you can give us just the first letter.
Juniper.
There you go, Juniper.
Juniper.
And since I
Yes.
interrupted you guys, will you guys talk about the commands to test jumbo frames?
I mean, that's going to depend. As far as commands on the switch goes, that's going to depend on a per vendor situation.
What about
So
the hosts?
on the hosts, you really don't have to do anything per se on the host. This is just on the networking side, specifically. I mean, if your hosts, if your host network adapters I think you have to manually set them to a lower level. I don't think we actually had to do anything on the host, if I recall correctly, Aaron, in your environment anyways.
We didn't have to do anything on the host, but I think what Ariel is talking about is testing to see if jumbo frames is functioning all the way through the network. And there are different
VMK
ping types, that you can use to test to see if your entire jumbo frame is available.
So
So,
Yeah.
to do network testing, I did do that in our initial rollout of jumbo frames, but after that, I kind of just trusted the fact that if it says it in the configuration, it's doing it.
Yeah, that's sort of been my take on it as well. Anytime I've run through this with a client or with in any sort of a deployment with NSX, is I've really just trusted the switch vendor that once it tells me that it's enabled, then I just go with it and show that it's enabled. If for some reason something's not working once we get further into the line, then I would look at it. But generally speaking, I've not ever had an issue where it was turned on and then something else wasn't being passed correctly. So
Here's another question. And remember, you're going to get a lot of questions like this, so be patient. Does NSX require a 10 gig uplink?
no.
No, I don't have 10 gig in the environment at this point. We've done, and we'll talk about this later, but LACP link aggregate ports. And other than that, I have everything else running through 1 gig.
Yeah. So the only time that you really would ever need 10 gig is if you just had that much bandwidth requirement in your environment, where you're just pushing huge amounts of data through. And I think in general, especially I think in a lot of environments, 10 gig is still sort of the standard when it comes to, data connectivity for like SANs and vSAN and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to general, host networking, gigabit still works, and LACP is a way that you can add a little bit to that, and we'll get into that in a second. So step 3, as we kind of roll through this, is sort of a lot of this is kind of basic stuff, right? But firmware updates. And specifically when I'm talking firmware updates, I mean the Ethernet adapters on your hosts should have their firmware up to date with whatever the VMware HCL says is what you should have, because essentially, if for some reason you run into an issue post NSX deployment and you need to contact GSS for support, on their checklist of things to check immediately is the firmware that your network adapters are running to make sure that it's supported. Because if it's on some other version that has not been tested by VMware, then that flags it in their system, and that they'll make you, maintenance mode the host, update the firmware, and it's a huge hassle. So if you can get this done at the outset, it's a really, one box ticked for later tech support calls if you need it. That'll save you some time, basically. All your switches should be updated to the latest stable release. That's sort of general best practice, I think, as well. I think I just heard something this week that there was some sort of a Cisco vulnerability that was found on Cisco switches that weren't updated. I know a lot of people in smaller networks, especially who don't have a dedicated network team, it's really easy to treat these things like a refrigerator, just plug it in and never touch it. but that's when you're rolling through a deployment like NSX, you've got to have this stuff up to snuff. Otherwise, you're just asking for trouble at some point. If you're replacing switches in this process beforehand, and if you have the resources, get ones that support VXLAN natively, because what that allows you to do is you can sort of offload some of the host-to-host communication resource to the switch directly, and the switch kind of knows how to pass traffic natively for the VXLAN tunnels that you set up in NSX. So it's sort of the next level of support. Not a lot of switch vendors have it today, but more and more and more and more are adding it. Aaron, I know you said you found some stuff that you had to update, and I know there was some stuff you could and some stuff you couldn't. Was there any gotchas that you saw or ran through when we were trying to update things?
I mean, nothing outside of, nothing NSX specific. You get switches that are so far behind and you have to hop firmware. You can't jump right from one version of firmware to another. Yep. Specifically on our vendor, I think if you're a full version behind, you have to hop 3 to 5 times depending on what releases came out in that version. So, your mileage may vary.
Yeah, it's an issue for sure, but it's good. All right. vSphere updates. So kind of the next level of this is making sure the hosts are fully patched, and make sure your vCenter is up to date. And it's because NSX is a vCenter dependent product. At least NSX for vSphere, I should specify, is a vCenter dependent product. It's really good to make sure you're on the latest current release of vCenter. And if you're not migrated to the VCSA, it's a great time to migrate to the vCenter appliance before you do this, just to get rid of that Windows box and have things, all run through the appliance. NTP, or network time, is a big one not to miss. I mean, it's required for a lot of VMware components to have it running, but basically the NSX manager won't start or run properly if it doesn't have access to an NTP server immediately. So that's, time sync in networking is super critical, especially for NSX. The vSphere standard switches and distributed virtual switches. So obviously NSX does majority of its stuff in the distributed virtual switch. In early versions of NSX, you couldn't do anything with a vSphere standard switch, but you can do some things with vSphere standard switch port groups now. It's still not recommended. The distributed virtual switch, configuring this, I'm sure probably has been a vBrownBag by itself. If it's not, it could. If it hasn't ever been, it could be. If you're not licensed, if you're running the old the vSphere standard or enterprise, you were not licensed for the distributed virtual switch until you get up to Enterprise Plus. However, if you buy NSX, they give you the rights to install a distributed virtual switch on one of those lesser versions. So it in short, you got to do the migration in this part of this process, and so you have to do it early and do it now, because you'll save yourself configuration trouble later on. And plus, once you go through this process, you get access to some other cool features. So Aaron, was there anything you ran into when you were migrating services over? Like I think we talked about it, and then I followed back up with you, and you're like, oh, it's done. So
yeah, for the most part, it wasn't a big problem. One thing I found out is you don't want to migrate when you get to the point where you're migrating VMs from the VSS to the DVS. vCenter is really picky, and if it misses a ping during that migration, it can hose up some things pretty badly. So make sure that vCenter has a DNS server that it can contact the whole time while you're doing the migration of vCenter into the DVS. And make sure that you don't accidentally orphan any of your management VMKs for your hosts, because you can do that and then you can lose connection to your host. And if it's already in the DVS inside the host configuration, then you also cannot change the management port on your host to recover it. So GSS can get a little magical back in the back end. But
yeah. So there's these things called ephemeral port groups that you can create.
Right. And I have one set up so that my vCenter is in a DVS, but it's in an ephemeral port group in a DVS, which is accessible from the host DCUI and the host GUI.
Yeah, and that's sort of the tricky part of migrating some of the stuff over, is when you move those oh my gosh, I'm so tired. I'm losing I'm losing the acronyms. The VNICs. Help me, Aaron.
Come on, Aaron. Help him.
Yeah.
If I sound a little off, it's because 50% of the people in my family are sick right now, and so it was a long night last night.
Well, essentially, when you're moving to a DVS, you have a couple of different pieces, right? You have the physical NICs that you're tying into uplinks. You have the VM kernels. You have the VMs themselves. So my suggestion is always have a way back. Don't move too much at once, and make sure that you're not moving yourself into a situation you can't back out of.
Yeah. Don't paint yourself into a corner, I guess.
Right.
Is the way to get. Yeah.
Exactly.
I would even add that most people should be, if you have the licenses for it, you should be using the DVS just for port, for load-based teaming, and for ease of configuration. So don't wait until NSX comes to actually try this out and see how it can work for you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people fall into staying on the standard switches just because they're easy.
Well, it's like all networking, like you were talking about, right? You plug in a switch, it works. You said it's like a refrigerator.
Yeah.
You set up a VSS, it works. Why do you need to do anything to it?
Yeah.
So,
although today's refrigerators, you probably have to do firmware updates on.
Well, yeah, they can tweet, right?
Yeah. Okay, so next, after you get everything migrated into your distributed virtual switch, you can then get the fun times of enabling LACP. LACP is one of these technologies that, if you do a lot of reading online about it, it seems like it's sort of a divisive thing in technology, which that never happens, right? Everybody always agrees about everything. But the general thing is like if you're using it for, like, you can't use LACP for data-backed services like iSCSI. iSCSI doesn't play well with LACP. But for general networking traffic, it bundles a whole bunch of individual ports together as an aggregate, so you get speed benefit and redundancy benefit. So if you don't have that 10 gig backend on your network, you can enable LACP in your port groups and, take a bunch of physical 1 gig ports. And I think, Aaron, in your environment, we basically created a bunch of 4 gigabit and 2 gigabit port channels.
Correct.
Most switch vendors won't let you go above 8. That's like the max number you can do, because at some point, you're
sell you 10 gig.
Well, there's that, but there's that, but then the bandwidth limitation suddenly becomes the switch itself, because your switch can only pass so many packets at once. So if you were actually maxing out all 8 of those ports, then you're probably going to start to max out the total throughput of the switch itself pretty
why
quick.
You get a Juniper, man.
Yeah.
1 gig total throughput to each port.
Yeah. So, well, if you're running on the cheap, then you don't get that benefit. But so it's another one of these things where, you know, when you configure the distributed virtual switch, there's some gotchas in that configuration, and that's, you know, resources to look for, like the DVS. Like when I first ran through some stuff, I found a video series from Chris Wall when he did some stuff on his blog about setting up distributed virtual switch. So he's got good stuff out there. I'm sure there. Ariel, do you know if there was ever a vBrownBag on DVS setup or not?
So there's definitely some of them where it covers either the VCP study guide or the VCP NV study guide, and we also have not just vBrownBag, but you also have the VMware sessions that you know, that other people have done, just like you mentioned, Chris Wall, and Jason Nash. So there's a lot of information for it.
Yeah, and I think for people to look at, like I think Scott Lowe had something on LACP in setting that up with NSX as well. So I mean, there's a lot of the more popular people who have really good blogs out there on some of this stuff, have good resources for how to do this stuff, and they'll walk you through it. And you know, and also, yeah, tie back to Jason Nash. Thanks for reminding me of that, Ariel. If you have a Pluralsight subscription, go watch Jason Nash's NSX deployment series on Pluralsight. He literally steps through most of this in getting it stood up and turned on and running, and that's a really good resource to look at. IGMP snooping and multicast. So you'll hear some talk about or read about this thing called BUM traffic, which is broadcast, unicast, and multicast traffic, which is sort of the way traffic between the hosts is disseminated or communicating between them so that they can talk to each other over these things called VTEPS or VXLAN tunnel endpoints. And the transport, when you configure NSX, you set up these things called transport zones. And the transport zones are sort of, it's a software split between your hosts. So say you have a cluster of hosts that you want to be your management network, and you have a cluster of hosts for your accounting applications, and you have another cluster of hosts for research and development applications, and you want NSX networks to stretch across all three clusters. You would set up a global transport zone for that. And if you wanted a transport zone for NSX traffic to only go to one of those clusters, you'd set up a specific transport zone just for that cluster. And so it's sort of another way to segment traffic physically between different clusters. And when you set up these transport zones, there's 3 different modes you can use when you set these up. You know, and it's UniCast, which is basically it works everywhere technology. And then there's hybrid, which is a little bit of unicast, a tiny bit of multicast, and then there's full-on multicast mode. The full-on multicast mode is the most efficient way to do it, but it requires the most amount of setup on the front end. And so most places that I've seen this happen, you just do the hybrid mode, and the only real feature required for hybrid mode is IGMP snooping, which most switches have enabled by default, but not all. And so that's another one of the things, as you're going through the list of jumbo frames and all this stuff, IGMP snooping is another box to check, because depending upon the vendor, you may be running into a situation again where you have to reboot the switch or the entire switch stack, depending upon your vendor. That is that. The VLANs. So this is sort of another duh thing, but if you don't have a VLAN map for your physical network or for, you know, your network in general, make a VLAN map. You know, it's something. If you have one for the physical environment, you're going to want to basically update it and include now plans for virtual networks. You can do VLANs or VXLAN in NSX. The nice thing about VXLAN is, you know, as you go into this, you know, when you set up you will create one VLAN for VXLAN in your network, and if you go full VXLAN after that, that could potentially be the last VLAN you ever create, which is nice because if you're not a networking guy, and you don't create VLANs all the time, you have to kind of pull it out of your head at the last minute when you forget how to do it. Like I have been known to do sometimes.
Yeah,
so,
pull it out of your head. Right, Britton.
AKA Google.
Something tells me that he caused an outage in your company, Aaron.
No. To be honest with you, Britton was really good on this. He sat back and just told me where not to shoot myself in the foot.
Yeah, I actually didn't do anything. I just sat there and told him what to do, but it was great.
Probably the easiest paycheck he ever got.
Yeah, that was the nice part of it, is just I could just boss him around and give him a huge list of stuff to do, and I got to go home at night.
Nice.
So as you're going through your VLAN mapping and VXLAN mapping, I mean, it's kind of just this network planning exercise of, making sure that what's going where. And it's not unlike doing the discovery, except now you're planning the discovery, and where things should be going. So you just kind of have to be a little bit on the ball. And this is, organization, being organized in thoughts is not always the easiest thing for some IT people, but it's a good exercise to get through. Configure your subnets and DHCP. So here's sort of a gotcha scenario. So when you are setting up your hosts, and they need to get IP addresses assigned to them for VXLAN or for the VTEPS, for the VXLAN tunnel endpoints. When you're creating, basically each host will get a certain number of IPs added to them based on some requirements. And in one deployment where I came in sort of halfway through, they'd already started. They ran out of IPs for their VTEPs because they got real fancy and they'd thought that they would only need a really small subnet, and so they took like part of a /24 and cut it down to like 12 IPs or 11 IPs. And because of the mode of VXLAN that they had to enable, because of their switch backing, and because of another, because of the mode of the communication between the hosts, basically, or the number of NICs on the hosts is the other factor. One host took 90% of the available IP addresses that they had to carved out for their VXLAN tunnel endpoints. So when NSX prepared the hosts, only one of like 8 hosts actually got prepared for NSX properly. The rest of them didn't get anywhere. So try not to get too fancy with this stuff. I always pretty much tell people, if you're setting up a subnet for any IP pool component of NSX, so when you set up this, you'll create these IP pools for the controllers, appliances, and you'll set up IP pools for the VXLAN tunnel endpoints. I would, in general, unless you're doing this in a huge scale, just give it a full /24 subnet, give it 254 addresses, and just let it ride. Because if your company goes through a major expansion at some point, they may need that overhead. And it's just, you can't, you have to do it on the front end here, because you can't easily go back and change it, is the point. If you don't have enough IPs in your pools, you kind of have to you can have to put the peel back on the onion in order to redo it. And that's what I had to do in this other deployment I did. We actually had to unconfigure a whole bunch of stuff, fix the IP pools, and then reconfigure everything. So just don't be fancy about your subnets. vShield, this was fun, Aaron, right?
Yeah, vShield's great.
So here's the big thing about vShield, and it's another one of these things. It's a refrigerator type of an appliance, right? So a lot of places, like at Hatco, they had an antivirus vendor that was doing AV for their Horizon deployment, and so that's what you need vShield for. And now the problem is with vShield, it was now replaced, or it has now been replaced by NSX Manager. So if, in order to kind of keep the data that it's already retaining for running your antivirus application, you have to upgrade from vShield to NSX Manager. And as we learned in this process, thankfully I've done it enough times now where I know back everything up as much as possible before you do anything. This is actually probably should be step 2 after the discovery, but so, and you have to, with these kind of applications, with NSX Manager, with vShield, you have to really use the built-in FTP backup. You can't necessarily rely on third-party backups. And make sure you have also, because sometimes these admin login credentials or the requirements are really long. And so you have to, keep good records of the logins for some of these appliances if you don't have that, which is another duh, but it happens. So Aaron, what happened to vShield? We had some issues.
Yeah, we blew it up and it stopped working, and luckily we'd backed it up prior, and then we had to go through and we had to redeploy vShield with its configuration backup in place in order to get the actual upgrade migration to occur. Yeah. We tried it initially after backing it up, of course, because we try not to shoot ourselves in the foot too hard. And it just kind of seized and stopped working. And then we got to a point where it was call GSS or delete it and recreate it. And we decided it was easier to delete it and recreate it, which it was. I don't know, that took all of 45 minutes. And we got it back up and running, and then we did the migration.
And while we were waiting for that to happen, we also side by side deployed NSX Manager and a fresh install.
Yes.
Just to be on the safe side, if we got down the path, we're just like, well, if we can't restore the vShield, if the backup didn't work, then we'll just start fresh with a brand new NSX Manager installation, and we'll fix the antivirus after the fact. So, yeah. I mean, it's not a total, you're dead in the water scenario. It's just sort of a, be safe as you do it kind of a system. So,
I mean, the funny part is that after we upgraded from vShield to NSX Manager, it totally changed how our antivirus talks and is configured to talk to that piece of the puzzle anyway. So we ended up having to rebuild that whole connection from the antivirus vendor side anyway.
Yeah.
So,
but we didn't know that beforehand either.
No, absolutely not. Of course not. Why would we have known that beforehand? Who said that in documentation?
Yeah. And all they told us was that, oh yeah, sure, it'll work.
Yeah, it'll work great. Called them. They were like, oh yeah, we support that. And then they handed us a knowledge base article that told us how to do it.
Yeah. So kind of harping us still on backups. I haven't seen any documentation changes on this with the NSX 6.4, but basically the third-party backups like Veeam or any other third-party backup solution, as far as I have been told and read and made aware, they are not technically recommended or supported for NSX components. Like,
you have a bad time.
Like the NSX controllers or NSX Manager or any of that stuff. If you lose one of those VMs, basically you have to redeploy it from a backup. You can't rely on restoring it from a,
Very similar to the VCSA. You're sitting there, backing up the VCSA with something like a Veeam or a Druva or a backup exec or whatever. And if you try to redeploy that backed up entire VM, it's always got problems with it. It's much better to pull the config off using the FTP or the HTTP backup included inside the new VCSA interface, and then deploying a recovery VCSA using the configuration. You're going to have a much better time. The same way that happens, this is how that's built as well.
Yep. And, as a side note, like, I don't know if you've had this, Aaron, but I had recently, just in the last 3 months, 2 VCSAs just go belly up on me for no reason. And only one time did I have a backup to go back to.
I recently restored a VCSA myself, but I did it in a way, it was the method that I used to migrate my VCSA into a 2-node direct connect vSAN.
Yeah. So that's sort of the moral of the story with these things is make sure you've got, a decent third, SFTP or FTP backup solution where you could dump this stuff and have it on a schedule because things change in the environment, and have it be automated.
Yeah, I just built a FileZilla on a Windows box, and I point everything to it, and it works great.
Yeah. And I guess to bring it full circle, once you have that data backed up there, then you can back that stuff up, with a traditional backup vendor like Veeam or something like that. But you can't do it out of the box.
Back up your backups. Are you crazy?
Yeah. The 3-2-1 rule. So Log Insight. This is your homework assignment, everybody. If you're not running it, go deploy it tomorrow. And
if you own vCenter, you own Log Insight.
Exactly. That is the mantra that we always say at the vMugs. Who owns a Log Insight? Everybody owns Log Insight. And there is this really cool thing that we just kind of discovered in this process. There's a NSX plugin for Log Insight. So NSX has a lot of areas where it can dump information to a traditional syslog server. And so as we were looking through this, we're just like, where can we put some of this stuff? If you don't have a syslog server, what do you do with it? And Log Insight can actually take that data and give you cool stuff with it. So Aaron, how cool is Log Insight?
Log Insight is really cool. It has the capability to kind of dig into anything from vCenter logs to ESXi host logs to pretty much anything that you want to point to it from a VMware perspective. If you're using the vCenter-based licensing, it limits you on what other things you can add. You can't add anything outside of the VMware stack. But like Britton said, there's an NSX plugin, and if you own NSX and it's licensed, then you can add your NSX license into the Log Insight instance as well. And all of your NSX components can hook into your Log Insight. And I'm not positive on this, but I'm pretty sure they don't count against the 25 OSIs that the vCenter Log Insight is limited to. I think they're counted outside of that.
Yeah, that's so, if you haven't bought the full release of Log Insight that covers your whole environment, the 25 is what you get for free.
Yeah, 25 different pieces of technology can hook into Log Insight. They call them OSIs, whatever that stands for. But yeah, it is a really cool and a very underutilized benefit that everybody gets.
Yes. So everybody, I would love to see some hashtag vBrownBag tweets tomorrow stating the fact that you deployed Log Insight because you heard it here first. So Ariel, can we start a new hashtag for that? Maybe I can't think of what that would be right now, but
Britton gave me homework.
Yes. Hashtag Britton gave me homework. I deployed Log Insight. Tweet that when you watch this.
And by the way, deploying this is like click simple. It's just an OVA.
Yeah.
You give it some information, and then once you got it up and running, you hook your vCenter into it. You click another button, and it goes out and configures all of your hosts to point their syslog to it. If you're in a situation where you're currently just offloading all of your host logs to a SAN or anything like that, this gives you not only an aggregate point that counts towards putting them onto, storage that isn't, a SD card or whatever else you got ESXi installed on. But it also gives you the ability to dig into all those different pieces. And if you have a GSS call, this is invaluable.
So what would GSS be able to pull out of this then? In your experience?
So if you're having an issue, what is the first thing GSS asks you to do? Pull logs.
Pull logs. Yeah.
You already got them. So point them right to your Log Insight and tell them to go nuts.
Yeah, that right there is worth deploying it.
Hey Britton, I'm telling everybody that you're gonna send them a sticker if they actually send you a picture of it.
All right, if I make stickers, I'll do that. So, we're getting kind of really close to be the end of this here. So if you're doing an NSX deployment, and you've bought the product, your salesperson probably, sold you vRealize Network Insight as well.
Yes, my very awesome sales guy definitely did.
Yeah. And this one was a new one for me. I had played a little bit with Network Insight, and I had not done a full production deployment of it. So I learned along with Aaron on this one, sort of how things work to get things from one place to another. And if you're going to be doing an NSX deployment, it actually does benefit you to especially once you have your distributed virtual switch fully configured, to stand up Network Insight first, so that it can plug into your distributed virtual switch and start pulling network traffic data, because you want that to kind of sit in your environment for a little while and gather and learn, and identify what's going where. So Network Insight deploys in 2 machines typically, depends on how spread out your network is. And then you have to enable NetFlow on the VDS, and then you enable IP fixed inside of VRNI after that. And then there's the manual kind of pieces, the setting up applications inside of VRNI. And Aaron, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, right off the bat, I'd say probably the biggest hurt that VRNI lays on you is the fact that the controller machine and the proxy machine are large. 32 gig of RAM, 16 CPU. They can be pretty big for smaller deployments. So if you have a smaller deployment, I would caution you against it. There's no way to deploy VRNI in a tiny or small infrastructure at this point. It's kind of one size fits all. And then, as Britton said, if you're having a large network, then you get to deploy more of those nodes around your network.
Yeah.
So, some of the things that we really kind of learned when we were deploying VRNI was, leave it in for 2 weeks or more. You're really not going to get all the traffic information you need unless you get in VRNI in for 2 weeks or more. It does have some microsegmentation planning. So if you're thinking about distributed firewall or microseg as the points for your NSX like we were, then VRNI can be a really big help there. There are ways to determine applications inside VRNI. So you can take a look at those net flows, and then you can build applications based on different dynamic parameters like VMs or containers or different things like that that you have inside of your vSphere deployment. And then based on those applications, it will provide you with rules, firewall rules that you can suck out of VRNI and then ingest into NSX. And that process, it needs to be a little bit better documented. Britton and I found out that there are about 5 ways to do it, and if you talk to somebody at VMware, they will each tell you a different way. So
yeah, and it's all manual.
Yeah, a lot of it's API driven. We got to know Postman pretty well, and if you're not familiar with Postman, it's pretty cool.
I shouldn't say it's manual. It's automated manual, but it's not a quick export from this click and drag import into NSX like we expected it to be.
Yeah, it's API command line driven.
Yeah. So basically, and that's by design. They want to have some sort of a middleman feature to manage those rules crossing the threshold.
Right. So VRNI is completely read-only.
Yeah.
So there's nothing that VRNI can do to screw up your infrastructure. The only thing that VRNI can write out is the IP fix change, and other than that, VRNI is read-only. It only reads what's going on in your network. It cannot cause configuration changes.
Yep. And two, I think it's like we even saw some chatty stuff from your physical network popping into VRNI as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It'll see anything that's coming into the virtualized network, whether that is inside your virtual stack, or if it's stuff that's outside talking in or inside talking out. So it knows, this VM is talking to the internet. It knows that this VM is talking to something. They put in a placeholder, other physical data center. So if you have, non-virtualized workloads, it knows that it's talking to something out there, and it puts in a placeholder, and then you just have to take a look at what the IP is, and when you ingest the rules into NSX, create rules around those different physical workloads.
Yep. So I mean, there used to be a mode that VRNI or Network Insight could be deployed even if you hadn't bought the product. There was a assessment mode that you could run it in for free. I think you have to work with a partner to get that. But basically, it does this. It does some of this kind of watching your network thing in this assessment mode, and it just kind of gives you the graphical, showcase of what it found. But it doesn't actually let you do anything with it until you buy it.
And it does have the ability to hook into some physical sections of your network. If your switches are capable of the VXLAN tie-ins, you can use those same tie-ins to kind of extend VRNI out into those spaces.
Yep. So once you've kind of gotten all of that stuff done, you are basically ready to deploy NSX Manager. And, like in Aaron and I's case, this was 3 or 4 weeks of work before we got to this point.
Yeah, the first 2 weeks, we literally just sat in a room and talked about it and mapped out different things. We did not touch a configuration change until week 3, I want to say.
Yeah, and that's where I would caution somebody. If you're looking to do an NSX deployment, if somebody's coming at you and saying, "Oh no, we can do this tomorrow," I would be cautious about that, because I've seen things go wrong in NSX deployments where you miss one step and it literally causes production outages for certain applications because something was wasn't thought through. And so you can't be in a rush to deploy this thing. It literally touches your entire network, and you just can't be willy-nilly about that. You've got to do careful planning, do your thing, map things out, to create your subnet maps and routing maps. And I mean we once you get into this, even doing some stuff later on, like configuring OSPF so that your virtual networks inside can talk to your physical networks outside. That's even a whole nother hoop to jump through. That
was real fun.
Yeah, and so it's the fun never ends, really, with NSX. but once you've gotten this far, I would say you're ready to go ahead and deploy the appliance and get it plugged into vCenter, so that you can then prep your host, deploy controllers, enable your VXLAN, create transport zones, and and then the real work begins of actually securing your environment. It's just like I aptly show with 3 dots, it's to be continued at that point, because now you've got now you not only have NSX in your environment and it's securing stuff for you, but now you've also given yourself a task annually, I would say, at the very least, to go through an upgrade path, because NSX is one of these products that you have to keep it upgraded, I think, because if they're chopping off the old versions out of support pretty quickly. And so as they keep coming out with new versions, you got to stay on top of this thing. It's not an application you can deploy and set it up once and forget it for 5 years, because if you wait that long, you're going to be in a world of hurt when you try to go to upgrade that.
So to be clear,
and it has
to be clear.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Not a fridge.
Not a fridge.
No, it's not.
More like a tweeting fridge.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and also it has interdependencies too, Britton. That if you're going to be keeping up the cadence on upgrading your vSphere environment, your vCenter, your ESI host, you have to include this in that upgrade path. If you're, upgrading anything in your VMware environment, this has to be a part of it.
Yep. So do we have any other questions or anything else pop in, Ariel?
There was a lot of comments, but one question that I have is, what did you guys read, or what do you consider the most valuable investment in time when it comes to documentation that helped you a lot throughout your project?
That's a good question. I mean, in this particular deployment, I mean, the areas that we ran into trouble was like with the vShield stuff and upgrading that. I know we had to do a little bit of digging on that, and really there was just like, I think there was one vblog from some VMware blogger out there who ran into a similar thing with his vShield upgrade. But in general, I can't say that there was, a whole lot of resources. I mean, the outside resources that we had to use, not that I'm recalling, Aaron, anyways.
Yeah, there was, I'm trying to remember where it was, but there was some NSX day 1, day 2 PDFs that were posted onto one of the NSX pages on VMware.com that was helping me sleep for a couple weeks before the deployment.
Yep.
And I think it was really helpful in trying to figure out where we were going to go next, right? So the question you ask yourself is, every time you hit a milestone in an NSX deployment, is, okay, what's next? Because it always seems like you're trying to eat the elephant, and then every time you feel like you've taken a couple bites out, you see another elephant popped up behind the one you're trying to eat.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the biggest problem with NSX, is there's so much there that there's no way you're going to do it all right away. And so basically, the biggest thing that we did was we brought the scope of the project down, and we said, okay, here's what we need to do, and here's our timeline to do this thing. And then once we got that done, we said, okay, check that off the list. What's next? Here it is, and here's what we've given ourselves for a timeline to do that. And once you just start to knock those things down one after another, you find out that, hey, we've built this environment, and now it does all these really cool things.
Yeah, from my side, what I've heard people say is the NSX design guide, which is, I think, available for communities, is a good read.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest too. Is there is the design guide? I think it's updated fairly regularly as well. And then they cover a lot of different scenarios in the actual design process. And I'm and a lot, we had to, not to toot my own horn too much, but I mean, a lot of this I've done enough that, I was just able to kind of walk Aaron through. And this is where, if you're doing this, if you're not a networking person, or if you're not, an NSX person specifically, working with a partner who knows what they're doing is a big key to this thing not going wrong. Because if NSX goes wrong in your environment, it can go horribly wrong.
And there were plenty of places where, without Britton's help, I would have shot myself right in the foot, because a lot of this stuff is not obvious. We talked about a lot of the prep work that is obvious, but it's only obvious when somebody sits here and says, "Oh, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this." If you're just left up to yourself or a small team to kind of figure this stuff out on your own, you're going to miss a step. And the problem with all these obvious steps is they're all also crucial.
Yep.
And if you miss one of these obvious steps, then you're going to hit a wall eventually, and you're going to have a hard time rolling it back.
And that's the real kind of thing to note in this whole thing, is there's just no easy way to put that thing back together, or to decouple it and then put it back together. I mean, it's so interwoven in your environment. I mean, you can prepare a host for NSX without having to reboot the host, but if you're going to unprepare or uninstall NSX from a host, it's a host reboot.
Yeah, you're ripping VIBs out through the command line. Yeah,
so it's just not something you want to be messing around with necessarily. So, and I'm, it's something I have to keep going through ongoing training myself with. So, I mean, I'm going to be attending a NSX Live Fire training event at the end of the month for partners to learn more how to do more NSX deployments, and it's something that like I'm certified on NSX, but I have to re-up my VCPs on the new versions. So it's just one of these things where, you know, if you're going to be in this game, you got to be all in. I would say probably the couple of the best resources for learning how to do this stuff is, like I said, the Jason Nash course on Pluralsight is a start. And then secondarily, go take the Install, Configure, Manage class from VMware. That is an excellent course done by some really, really smart people. They spend a lot of the ICM class, a lot of that time is spent on really just managing and understanding how the VXLAN tunnel endpoint traffic and the BUM traffic is walked. So there's whole modules where you do the packet walks from one host to another host. And so they want to really make sure you understand the nitty-gritty details of, you know, how a packet gets from A to B in that scenario. So it's one of those classes that's worth it to really take and go through.
And I'll add something that in my case it helped a lot was the VCP6 NV study guidebook by Elderson and Associates. That helped me a lot, and it has a lot of information. It's a really thick book, but it's chock full of good stuff. And that was the guy that did the first NSX trainings, so you know he's legit.
Yeah,
Elver's a good guy.
Yeah, and if you run into anything ever, just send me a tweet, and if I don't know what it is, then I'll ask Tim Davis. So.
But talking about getting trained and stuff, Graham wrote up a great point, which is VMUG Advantage has not only access to the bits so people can actually lab it at home, but there's a lot of you get some licenses, and I think you still get some preferential stuff for NSX, which, considering it's $180 for VMUG Advantage, you get a lot of good stuff with it.
Yeah, you absolutely do. You should go out there and buy one today.
Yes.
And one last question that we got from Mamo, Tesfaye. Sorry if I butcher your name. He asked, in your particular project, did you use microsegmentation and stretch VXLAN for DR? Like, did you do the whole thing, or did you start small? How are your stages?
We started this project out with the scope of we wanted to do the distributed firewall. Microseg was a day two thing for us, or you could probably call it a quarter two thing for us. And so we got distributed firewall in place, and fortunately and unfortunately, fortunately for myself, unfortunately for the company that I work for, I'm actually going to be changing jobs, and my replacement doesn't really know NSX too well, so we're hoping that Britton will continue on as a consultant to really help that project move forward. But microseg is something that I put the skeleton in for. We don't have it in production yet, but I've tested it and it works. And the reason we've stopped is because of my resignation with ATCO.
And yeah, so do you want to say where you're going, Aaron, or not?
Yeah, I can say where I'm going. I'm going to a small company called VMware.
Yeah, so congratulations. Yay.
Thank you.
They let him in? I'm sorry, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. So ATCO's put all current projects on hold right now while we're kind of spinning up some knowledge in the next generation of administrators for ATCO.
Yep, and now I've pre-trained you on how to do these SE deployments for NSX. So
you bet, exactly.
Yeah. I think that's pretty much it, Ariel. I don't have really any other slides necessarily to show, except to plug my podcast one more time with my good buddy Tony Reeves. And then, at some point after Aaron's been at VMware for a while, we're going to have him on the podcast so he can tell us what it's like to be on the other end of that fire hose of information. So,
fire hose of the Kool-Aid, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, guys, I had a blast. We got a lot of information. We got a lot of questions. If I were you, I would check Twitter. And finally, thank you everybody who attended. I really appreciate it every time that we have live questions. It makes it so much more fun. You're getting props and thank you from the attendees. So pleasure having you.
Thank you, Ariel.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel, for hosting. It was great to see you the other day, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon.
Yep, I am going to send that picture so I can get my sticker.
There you go.
Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next weekend. I'm sorry, next Wednesday. Take care.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Bye.